Coming up on Arirang News, South Korean President Moon Jae-in heads to Washington to meet with President Trump and hopefully find a way for the U.S. and North Korea to start talking again. But there are signs the U.S. stance might get even tougher. The IMF slashes its forecast for global economic growth to the lowest level in 3 years, but it sees steady growth for South Korea thanks to government policy. And unemployment is down in South Korea, 250,000 people newly working compared to a year ago, but still weakness in manufacturing jobs. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to our afternoon broadcast. I'm Devin Whiting. President Moon is scheduled to leave in about an hour from now for Washington, where he'll meet with several top officials and then with President Trump for about 2 hours. Shin Se-min tells us more.
Embarking on a whistle-stop trip to Washington for a North Korea-focused summit with his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump, President Moon Jae-in's mission is to hammer home the importance of the top-down approach used so far in the denuclearization talks and the need for North Korea and the U.S. to start communicating again. The South Korean leader is set to leave for Washington on Wednesday afternoon for what will be his 7th face-to-face with President Trump.
This summit is based on the need for both sides to consult with each other and revive the momentum for dialogue after the Hanoi summit. In the U.S., President Moon will continue his top-down approach and look for concrete ways to achieve the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
This summit comes at a time when there seems to be consensus both Seoul and Washington can get nuclear diplomacy back on track, even though the most recent meeting between the leaders of North Korea and the U.S. ended with no concrete outcome in February. South Korea's first couple will arrive in Washington on April 10th local time, upon which President Moon will meet with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, and Vice President Mike Pence, respectively. All three, like President Trump, have been vocal about pushing for the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Then the summit between Presidents Moon and Trump will take place for about 2 hours at the White House. It'll be followed by an extended meeting with senior presidential aides. Though not fully disclosed, it's likely President Moon may raise the need to loosen sanctions on Pyongyang or provide incentives to North Korea that makes life easier for ordinary North Koreans. The leaders may also cover their military cost-sharing framework, bilateral trade issues, and even a reciprocal visit to Seoul by President Trump in the first half of the year. Bringing the leaders Kim and Trump back to the negotiating table might not be much of a trouble, given that it's not the first and that neither has shot down the idea. But the big unknown is whether President Moon's trip to Washington this week will help find a middle ground between Trump's all-or-nothing strategy and Kim's small deal approach. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, a sign the U.S. might be taking an even tougher stance on North Korea. Mike Pompeo has for the first time referenced the regime's conventional weapons as something the U.S. would like to talk about. Lee Ji-won has more.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reiterated that Washington's goal on North Korea is the regime's final fully verified denuclearization, but with a slight addition of less risk in conventional measures. Pompeo explained before a U.S. Senate Appropriations Subcommittee hearing on Tuesday that the U.S. objective also includes a brighter future for the North Korean people. This is the first time Pompeo has mentioned the risks associated with North Korea's conventional weapons. While the issue of denuclearization has been discussed by Pyongyang and Washington, alleviating military tensions caused by conventional weapons has been discussed by the two Koreas alone, and Pompeo's latest comments have raised speculation on whether the U.S. stance has gotten tougher on the North. Pompeo also answered yes when asked if the strong sanctions will remain in place during the denuclearization talks with the North. He said the U.S. also forced a global coalition at the United Nations to enforce the toughest ever sanctions on North Korea. And to a question on whether he thinks North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is a tyrant, Pompeo answered sure, and that he has said that in the past too. This is also uncommon, as the U.S. has been careful not to make sensitive and aggressive comments towards the regime since the start of their dialogue. The comments come amid a standstill between the North and the U.S. as Pyongyang seeks partial alleviation of sanctions for step-by-step denuclearization measures, while the U.S. seeks concrete denuclearization steps and an overall roadmap from the North in exchange for sanctions relief. And with the South Korea-U.S. summit to take place later this week, where the leaders are expected to look for a middle ground to get Pyongyang and Washington back on track for dialogue, observers are keeping a close eye on whether Pompeo's firm stance is just rhetoric or an actual change in the U.S. stance. 이지원, Arirang News.
North Korea, meanwhile, is holding several important party meetings this week to discuss its future policies. Pyongyang's state-run Korean Central News Agency reports that Kim Jong-un presided Tuesday over a meeting of the Politburo. He reportedly urged the officials to be, quote, self-reliant, which is seen as a reference to surviving the ongoing sanctions. The agency says the North Korean ruling party's Central Committee will hold a plenary meeting on Wednesday. That meeting is expected to see announcements about future economic policies and possibly denuclearization. And those decisions will be ratified by the North's parliament, the Supreme People's Assembly, on Thursday. South Korea's National Assembly held a ceremony this morning to mark 100 years since the Provisional Assembly first met in exile, back when Imperial Japan ruled the peninsula. That historic meeting was in Shanghai, where the Assembly enacted the Provisional Constitution and decided to name the country the Republic of Korea. National Assembly Speaker Moon Hee-sang said it's time to look back at the past 100 years and see if the National Assembly is living up to the Republican and parliamentarian values of those days. For the 100 years to come, he said, the country needs a paradigm shift, starting with reform of the Constitution and of the so-called imperial presidential system. This morning's ceremony also saw a relative of Heung-min, the last speaker of the legislature in exile, donate the Provisional Assembly's official seal. A similar commemoration will be held tonight in Shanghai. President Moon has made a personal donation of money to help the victims of last week's devastating wildfire in Gangwon-do province. Blue House deputy spokesperson Ko Min-jung said Wednesday that the president and the First Lady made the donation through a disaster relief association to comfort the victims and help them rebuild their lives. Other presidential aides, she said, also sent around $41.8 thousand to those affected by the fire that killed one person and forced some 4,000 to flee their homes. In football, South Korean forward Son Heung-min has scored again for Tottenham Hotspur, this time in their quarterfinal first leg match against Manchester City. Son broke the deadlock in the 78th minute, scoring from close range at Tottenham's new stadium to give his side a 1-0 advantage going into next Wednesday's second leg in Manchester. With Son's 10th career goal in the Champions League, he's become Asia's second top scorer in the competition, following Uzbekistan and Dynamo Kiev legend Maxim Shachik. Another downward revision for the global economy. The International Monetary Fund has slashed its global economic outlook for this year to the lowest level since 2016. South Korea's growth forecast, however, remains unchanged. Kim Yo-sun reports.
The IMF has downgraded its world economic outlook for 2019, warning of a global economic slowdown. It forecasts the world economy will grow 3.3% this year, down from the 3.5% it had forecast for 2019 in January. This is the lowest level of forecast in 3 years. Describing the present as a delicate moment, the IMF's chief economist explained that the global economy will recover during the latter half of the year and reach 3.6% growth in 2020. The IMF pointed to trade tensions, Brexit, and other political uncertainties as some of the risks facing the world economy. The IMF has maintained its 2019 growth forecast for South Korea unchanged at 2.6%. Its World Economic Outlook released on Tuesday also forecasts the country's economy to improve in 2020 with 2.8% growth. The South Korean government stimulus package, including a supplementary budget, is seen as the major reason behind the fund maintaining the country's economic outlook amid a lowered global economic forecast. The IMF also pointed out that South Korea should adopt expansionary monetary policies or credit easing policy in case the economy faces challenges. Kim Hye-sun, Arirang News.
Finally, a glint of light for job seekers here in South Korea. Last month, the jobless rate was down slightly, bringing the employment rate to 60%, a new record for the month of March. Kim Da-mi has the details.
The upswing in South Korea's job market continued in March as 250,000 more people were newly employed compared to the previous year, surpassing the 200,000 mark for the second straight month. The jobless rate also edged down 0.2% on-year to 4.3%. This means almost 27 million people were working in South Korea as of last month. The uptick in the employment rate was also seen across all age groups except for those in their 40s. Statistics Korea, which collected the data, credited the overall increase to a higher number of people employed in their 60s, as well as to more jobs created in the country's health and social services sectors. South Korea's new 52-hour workweek regulations also played a role in the jump.
Most of the jobs created are not entirely new. Because of 52-hour work week, part-time jobs of less than 17 hours a week have emerged as replacements.
However, the number of jobs in the manufacturing sector, for which South Korea is heavily reliant, fell by almost 110,000, the 12th straight month of losses. Experts pointed to sluggish growth in the manufacturing and retail sectors as the main reason for the job losses. In order to boost job growth in all sectors, the government is planning to create some 158,000 new jobs in various sectors, including artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and innovative industries by the year 2022. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Now, the Trump administration is threatening billions of dollars in new tariffs on Europe. Hong-yu has the details on those and the EU's response.
The U.S. is considering imposing tariffs on $11 billion worth of goods from the European Union due to EU subsidies that support Boeing's rival Airbus. President Trump tweeted on Tuesday that the World Trade Organization finds that the European Union subsidies to Airbus have adversely impacted the United States, which will now put tariffs on $11 billion of EU products. And he added that the EU has taken advantage of the U.S. on trade for many years. The U.S. Trade Representative verified they're preparing a list of European products to tax as retaliation for European subsidies to Airbus, which had been ruled as illegal by the WTO in May 2018. In response, the EU said the tariff was greatly exaggerated, and they announced that they too are making a list of tariffs to counter American subsidies to Boeing. These tit-for-tat tariffs started when President Trump taxed European steel and aluminum last year and threatened to impose tariffs on their cars and car parts as well if the EU did not agree to better trade terms for American products. In retaliation, the EU imposed $3.2 billion worth of tariffs on U.S. goods last June. The U.S. decision to impose tariffs is expected this summer as soon as the WTO makes its ruling. Hong-yu, Arirang News.
EU leaders are considering pushing back Brexit until the end of the year, which would mean rejecting the shorter delay to June 30th requested by British Prime Minister Theresa May. The delay would allow the UK to participate in the European parliamentary elections at the end of May. EU members are still debating the conditions for an extension, saying the British side must outline a clear plan with credible political domestic backing to justify the decision of the European Council to greenlight an extra extension. Finance chiefs and central bank governors of the G20 countries are meeting in Washington to discuss the global economy and its prospects and risks. The governor of the Bank of Korea, Lee Ju-yeol, is there too. While in Washington, he is also scheduled to attend annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group on Friday to discuss ways to stabilize the global financial system. The first 5G phones to hit the U.S. market next month will be ones made by Samsung and LG, giving them a potentially lucrative head start on Apple. According to industry sources, the Samsung Galaxy S10 5G will debut with Verizon on May 16th. Verizon's 5G services began earlier this month using a Motorola phone with a clip-on modem. As for LG, it's partnered with Sprint to launch the V50 ThinQ, a phone to be released here in Korea a little sooner on April 19th. Sprint says its 5G services will start in Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, and Kansas City. No word from Apple yet on its plans for 5G phones, though analysts say it might wait until 2020 or even 2021. Korea's economy depends on exports, and shipments are falling, especially in semiconductors. Now, Ko Ryun-hee spoke with some experts about this problem, and they say things could get better for computer chips fairly soon, but they also suggest that Korea should diversify.
Semiconductor exports, which account for around 20% of Korea's total exports, continue to struggle. The total amount of outbound shipments have been continuously decreasing on year since December last year. According to the Trade Ministry, exports decreased 16.6% last March, a huge tumble from the 44.2% increase posted the previous year. Analysts are pointing to the lower demand for chips due to poor smartphone sales and less investment in data centers as the reasoning behind the decline. Data from China's government-affiliated research institute shows that smartphone shipments to China in February fell to their lowest in 6 years as consumers held off on making purchases amid a slowing economy. The ongoing trade tensions between the U.S. and China were also attributed to the lack of investment. The decline in demand has also led to the lowering of prices. For instance, the average selling price of one particular type of DRAM chip has been on a continuous decline since the third quarter of last year. So when will this downturn start to recover? An expert in the field says chip sales are likely to pick up in the second half of this year.
I expect that the situation will be better in the second half of 2019, but we should be aware of some variables in the future. These include the negotiating process between Washington and Beijing and the development of 5G-related industries. These businesses require storage for a large amount of data, which will lead to an increase in demand of memory chips.
And in terms of what chip companies can do until then, analysts say it's time to venture into other sectors outside the memory field, where most of the current investment is being made.
Let's take a look at the example of Samsung Electronics. Due to the company's huge success in memory semiconductors, it has not invested a lot in other types, such as system on chips. Also, fostering small and mid-sized companies capable of developing system on chips is important as well.
As for the role of the government, analysts say it's crucial to secure competent Korean workers in the field because some Chinese companies are already in the process of recruiting them. Ko Ryun-hee, Arirang News.
Now it's time to catch up on the market action in Korea and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Dr. Hwang Se-un, Research Fellow at the Korea Capital Market Institute. Thanks for coming on today, Dr. Hwang.
Good afternoon.
So President Trump has proposed new tariffs on Europe over the EU's subsidies for Airbus, and that could result in retaliation from the EU. And this sent U.S. stocks down a fair bit overnight. Tell us what happened there and in other markets.
U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to impose tariffs on $11 billion worth of European Union products, heightening tensions over a long-running transatlantic aircraft subsidy dispute. In addition to this, the International Monetary Fund cut its forecast for world economic growth this year on Tuesday, saying the global economy is slowing more than expected and that a sharp downturn could require world leaders to coordinate stimulus measures. On Wall Street, the S&P 500 gave up 0.61% and the Nasdaq Composite declined 0.56%. Asian shares stepped back from 8-month highs on Wednesday as the IMF lowered its global growth outlook and as tensions over tariffs between the United States and Europe escalated. Japan's Nikkei lost 0.53% and equities in Hong Kong moved in the same direction.
Well, now, has this EU tariff issue had an effect on Korean stocks? They're up. Take us through today's trade.
Okay, Korean shares closed higher Wednesday. Investor sentiment was subdued initially after the IMF lowered its forecast for global economic growth. The KOSPI rose 0.49% and the KOSDAQ rose 0.44%. The index took a cue from overnight losses on Wall Street after the IMF slashed its global growth forecast for 2019 to 3.3%, down from its 3.5% prediction made in January. The gap between strength in the stock markets and sluggishness in the real economy has been widening. Top market cap Samsung Electronics gained 0.11% today, and the Korean won was trading at 1,138 won against the U.S. dollar, which is down 1.71 from the previous session's close.
All right, got it. And now we've got oil prices rising because of the escalating conflict in Libya between the government and a rebel-led army there, and West Texas crude this week rising to a 5-month high. What do you see happening with oil?
Oil spiked to its highest level in 5 months as a drop in the U.S. dollar and conflicts from Iran to Libya helped make the crude oil look like an increasingly strong bet for investors. Crude futures rallied 2.1% in New York Monday. The dollar fell, improving the lure of commodities priced in the greenback. Meanwhile, fighter jets bombed in Tripoli airport in Libya, and U.S. President Donald Trump said he would designate Iran Revolutionary Guard a terrorist group. It's escalating tensions in two of the world's biggest producers. However, crude oil fell on Tuesday as Russian President Vladimir Putin clouded the outlook for production cuts that have helped power this year's rally. Brent crude futures slipped 0.7% on Tuesday after gaining the previous 3 days amid rising tensions in Libya. Putin said Russia is comfortable with current prices and not yet ready to say whether it wants to extend output curbs it orchestrated with OPEC. Oil price rally is more likely to subside as concerns on the global economic slowdown strengthen.
All right, Dr. Huang, we'll continue to watch that, but this is where we'll have to leave it today. Appreciate your insights as always.
Thank you very much.
That's it from Arirang News at this hour. More updates coming your way, though, at 7 p.m. Korea time. Bye for now.
South Korea is on the verge of falling off a demographic cliff, with radical changes being forecast in all facets of the country's society, including the labor market and the welfare of its senior citizens.
You think, oh, if I'm poor, I cannot have children.
Raising a family, first they have to think about getting a job, and the unemployment